Margaret Williams had always believed that kindness was the greatest gift one person could give to another. At 52, she worked 2 jobs to support her family, cleaning offices downtown during the day and stocking shelves at the local grocery store 3 evenings a week. Despite her own struggles, Margaret never passed by someone in need without offering help. It was a cold Tuesday morning in November when she first noticed the elderly man sitting alone on the bench outside Riverside Park. He appeared to be in his 70s, with silver hair that looked like it hadn't been properly combed in days and clothes that seemed too thin for the chilly weather. His shoulders were hunched forward, and he stared at the ground with an expression of deep loneliness that tugged at Margaret's heart. Margaret was walking to catch the bus to her cleaning job when she spotted him. Something about his posture reminded her of her own grandfather, who had passed away 5 years earlier. She remembered how isolated her grandfather had felt in his final years, especially after her grandmother died. The memory made her pause and look back at the stranger on the bench. Without thinking twice, Margaret approached the man. "Excuse me, sir," she said gently. "Are you all right? You look like you might be cold." The man looked up, startled by the interruption. His eyes were a pale blue, watery with age, and Margaret could see surprise mixed with wariness in his expression. It had probably been a long time since anyone had spoken to him with genuine concern. "I'm fine, thank you," he replied quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, but Margaret could see he was shivering slightly and his hands looked red from the cold. "My name is Margaret," she said, sitting down on the bench beside him. "I pass by here every morning on my way to work. I've seen you here a few times and I just wanted to make sure you're okay." The man studied her face for a moment as if trying to determine whether her kindness was genuine. "I'm Harold," he said finally. "Harold Peterson. And yes, I suppose I have been sitting here quite a bit lately." Margaret noticed that despite his disheveled appearance, Harold spoke with proper grammar and had an educated way of expressing himself. There was something about his bearing that suggested he hadn't always been in such circumstances. "Well, Harold, it's nice to meet you," Margaret said warmly. "Are you from around here?" Harold nodded slowly. "I used to live not too far from here. Now I'm staying at a small apartment across town. It gets lonely sometimes, so I come here to watch people go by. It makes me feel less alone even if I don't talk to anyone." Margaret's heart ached hearing this. She understood loneliness all too well. Even though she was surrounded by family and co-workers, she sometimes felt isolated by the constant struggle of making ends meet and worrying about her children's future. "I understand that feeling," she said. "Sometimes being around people, even strangers, can be comforting." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the morning commuters hurry past. Margaret noticed that Harold's stomach made a small rumbling sound, and she realized he might be hungry. "Harold, when was the last time you had a proper meal?" she asked gently. Harold looked embarrassed. "I had some crackers yesterday evening," he admitted. "I don't get out to shop for groceries very often, and delivery fees are expensive." Without hesitation, Margaret opened her purse and pulled out the lunch she had packed for herself: a sandwich, an apple, and a small bag of chips. "Please take this," she said, offering it to Harold. "I can grab something later." Harold's eyes filled with tears. "I couldn't possibly take your lunch," he protested. "You've already been so kind just by talking to me." "Nonsense," Margaret insisted. "My grandmother always said that food tastes better when it's shared with someone who needs it. Besides, I'd feel terrible knowing you're hungry when I have more than enough." Reluctantly, Harold accepted the food. As he unwrapped the sandwich, Margaret could see his hands trembling slightly. Whether from cold, hunger, or emotion, she wasn't sure. "This is very generous of you," Harold said, taking a small bite. "I haven't experienced such kindness from a stranger in a very long time." Margaret smiled. "We're not strangers anymore, Harold. We're friends now." As Harold ate, Margaret learned more about him. He had worked as an engineer for most of his life, and had been married to his beloved wife Eleanor for 48 years before she passed away 3 years ago. He had one son, but they had become estranged many years earlier due to a misunderstanding that had grown into a deep rift between them. "I was probably too proud and stubborn," Harold admitted. "I said things I shouldn't have said, and now it's been so long that I don't even know how to reach out to him anymore." Margaret listened with genuine interest and compassion. She could hear the regret in Harold's voice and see the pain in his eyes when he spoke about his son. "It's never too late to rebuild a relationship," she said softly. Sometimes all it takes is one person being willing to take the first step. Harold shook his head sadly. I'm not even sure he'd want to hear from me. He's probably better off without his bitter old father in his life. Before Margaret could respond, she heard the approaching bus and realized she was about to be late for work. She quickly stood up and gathered her things. I have to catch this bus, Harold, but I want you to know that meeting you has been the highlight of my morning, she said sincerely. Will you be here tomorrow? Harold nodded. I usually come here around the same time each day. Good, Margaret said, smiling. I'll look for you tomorrow, and maybe I'll bring an extra sandwich. As Margaret boarded the bus, she turned to wave at Harold through the window. He was still sitting on the bench, but now he was sitting up straighter, and she could swear she saw the hint of a smile on his weathered face. During her entire workday, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about Harold. She imagined how difficult it must be to lose the love of your life after nearly 50 years together, and then face the isolation that followed. She thought about his estranged son, and wondered what had happened between them that was so serious it had kept them apart for years. That evening, as Margaret prepared dinner for her own family, she made sure to pack an extra sandwich and some fruit for Harold. She also wrote a small note on a piece of paper that simply said, "You have a friend in Margaret. Never forget that you matter." Margaret had no idea that this simple act of kindness would set in motion a chain of events that would change not only Harold's life, but her own as well. Sometimes the smallest gestures create the biggest ripples, and Margaret's compassionate heart was about to prove that point in ways she could never have imagined. The next morning arrived with an unexpected warmth that seemed to lift Margaret's spirits even before she stepped outside. She had spent the previous evening thinking about Harold and wondering if he would actually be at the park. As she walked toward Riverside Park, carrying an extra lunch bag and the small note she had written, Margaret found herself hoping that her new friend would be there waiting. Sure enough, Harold was sitting on the same bench, but today he looked slightly different. His hair was combed more neatly, and he seemed to be watching for her arrival rather than staring at the ground. When he spotted Margaret approaching, his face broke into a genuine smile that transformed his entire appearance. "Margaret," Harold called out, standing up as she approached. "I wasn't entirely sure you'd come back." "Of course I came back," Margaret replied, settling onto the bench beside him. "I told you we're friends now, didn't I? And friends keep their promises." She handed Harold the lunch bag and watched as his eyes grew misty with gratitude. "You really didn't have to do this again," he said quietly. "I wanted to," Margaret assured him. "Besides, I made extra on purpose. My daughter always says I make too much food anyway." As Harold unpacked the lunch, Margaret noticed that he looked a bit better today. He still seemed thin and tired, but there was something in his posture that suggested hope might be returning to his life. "I have to confess something," Harold said as he bit into the sandwich. "Yesterday was one of the darkest days I've had since Eleanor died. I was sitting here thinking that maybe nobody would notice if I just disappeared. Then you came along and reminded me that there's still goodness in the world." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She realized that her simple act of kindness might have been more important than she had imagined. "Harold, I'm so glad I stopped to talk to you. We all need reminders sometimes that we're not alone." Over the following days, Margaret and Harold developed a routine. Every morning she would stop by the bench with extra food and spend 15 or 20 minutes talking with him before catching her bus to work. Harold began to open up more about his life, and Margaret learned fascinating details about his past. Harold had been a successful aerospace engineer who had worked on several important projects during his career. He had owned a comfortable home and had lived what most people would consider a privileged life. However, after Eleanor's death, he had struggled with depression and had gradually isolated himself from everyone he knew. "I stopped answering phone calls from friends," Harold admitted one morning. "I stopped going to social events. Eventually, people stopped trying to reach out to me. I convinced myself that I was better off alone, but the truth is, I was just scared of facing life without Eleanor." Margaret listened without judgment, understanding how grief could consume a person. She shared some of her own struggles as well, telling Harold about the challenges of raising two teenagers as a single mother after her husband had left 5 years earlier. "Some days I feel like I'm barely keeping my head above water," Margaret confessed. "Between work and trying to make sure my kids have what they need, I sometimes forget to take care of myself." But talking with you each morning has become something I look forward to. It reminds me that everyone is fighting battles we know nothing about. Their friendship deepened with each passing day. Harold began to take better care of himself, and Margaret noticed that he had started wearing cleaner clothes and seemed to have more energy. She had even convinced him to walk with her to a nearby coffee shop one morning when she had extra time. 3 weeks into their friendship, Harold surprised Margaret with a confession that revealed more about his mysterious past. "Margaret, I need to tell you something about my son," Harold said one morning, his voice heavy with emotion. "His name is David, and I haven't spoken to him in 12 years. Margaret waited patiently for Harold to continue, sensing that this was difficult for him to discuss. "David was always ambitious and driven even as a child," Harold continued. "He started his own business when he was just 25 years old. It was some kind of technology company, and I have to admit, I never really understood what he did. I was old-fashioned in my thinking, and I thought he should get a stable job with the established company instead of chasing what I called pipe dreams." Harold paused, staring at his hands. "When David's business started becoming successful, he wanted to share his excitement with me. He would call and try to explain his projects and his plans for expansion, but instead of being supportive, I was critical. I told him he was being reckless and that his success probably wouldn't last." Margaret could hear the regret in Harold's voice and reached over to pat his arm gently. "The final argument happened when David wanted to help me and Eleanor financially," Harold continued. "He had just signed some big contract and wanted to pay off our mortgage and set up trust funds for any grandchildren we might have someday. But I was too proud to accept his help. I accused him of trying to buy my respect and told him that his money meant nothing to me." Margaret winced, imagining how those words must have hurt David. David tried to explain that he just wanted to take care of us and show his appreciation for everything we had done for him growing up. But I was stubborn and angry, and I said terrible things. I told him that he had forgotten his values and that money had changed him into someone I didn't recognize. Harold's voice broke slightly. "The last thing David said to me was that he loved me despite everything, and that when I was ready to accept his love without conditions, he would be waiting. That was 12 years ago, and I've been too ashamed and too proud to reach out to him ever since." Margaret was quiet for a moment, processing everything Harold had shared. "Harold, do you know what your son is doing now?" Harold shrugged. "I assume his business either succeeded or failed. I've deliberately avoided looking him up or asking mutual friends about him. I told myself I didn't care, but the truth is I was afraid to find out. What if he's struggling and I could have helped? What if he's successful and doesn't need his old father anymore?" Margaret looked at Harold with deep compassion. "You know, Harold, from what you've told me about David, he sounds like a good man with a good heart. Good men don't forget their parents no matter how much time has passed." "Do you really think so?" Harold asked hopefully. "I do," Margaret said firmly. "And I think that maybe it's time for you to find out what David is up to these days. Not because you want anything from him, but because life is too short to let pride keep you separated from the people you love." Harold nodded slowly. "You might be right. Maybe it is time. But I wouldn't even know where to begin looking for him." Margaret smiled. "Leave that to me. I may not be a fancy engineer, but I know how to use the internet. My teenage kids have taught me a thing or two about finding people online." That afternoon, Margaret went to the public library during her lunch break and used one of their computers to search for information about Harold's son. What she discovered would shock them both and change everything they thought they knew about David Peterson's life. Margaret stared at the computer screen in complete disbelief, reading the same information over and over again to make sure she wasn't making a mistake. Her hands were trembling slightly as she scrolled through page after page of search results, each one confirming what seemed impossible to believe. David Peterson wasn't just successful, he was one of the most well-known billionaires in the country. His technology company, Peterson Innovations, had revolutionized the way people communicated through social media and digital platforms. Forbes magazine had recently ranked him as the 15th wealthiest person in America, with a net worth estimated at over $8 billion. Margaret clicked through articles about David's company, his philanthropic efforts, and his personal life. She learned that he was married to a woman named Sarah and had 2 children, a daughter named Emma who was 16 and a son named Michael who was 14. The realization hit Margaret like a thunderbolt. Harold had grandchildren he had never met. As she continued reading, Margaret discovered that David Peterson was known not just for his business success, but for his generous charitable giving. His foundation had donated hundreds of millions of dollars to causes ranging from education and poverty relief to medical research and environmental protection. One article mentioned that he had personally funded the construction of 12 homeless shelters across the country and had established scholarship programs that had sent over 5,000 underprivileged students to college. Margaret found herself crying as she read about David's character and values. Far from being corrupted by wealth, he seemed to have used his success to make the world a better place. The article quotes painted a picture of a man who was humble, thoughtful, and deeply committed to helping others. Exactly the kind of person Harold had raised him to be. One particular interview caught Margaret's attention. When asked about his motivation for giving so much to charity, David had said, "My parents taught me that success isn't measured by what you accumulate for yourself, but by what you're able to give to others. Every dollar I donate is a reflection of the values they instilled in me, even if they might not realize it." Margaret's heart broke as she read those words. Here was a son who still honored his parents' teachings and spoke about them with love and respect, even after 12 years of separation. She could only imagine how much pain David must be carrying, wondering about his aging parents and whether they were proud of what he had accomplished. The next morning, Margaret arrived at the park with a heavy heart and a manila folder full of printed articles about David Peterson. Harold was waiting on the bench as usual, but Margaret could see immediately that something was different about her friend. He looked more anxious than she had seen him in weeks. "Margaret, I've been thinking all night about what you said yesterday," Harold began before she even sat down, "about finding David and reaching out to him. I think you're right, but I'm terrified. What if he wants nothing to do with me? What if I've missed my chance?" Margaret sat down beside Harold and took a deep breath. "Harold, I need to show you something. Yesterday, I went to the library and did some research about your son." She handed Harold the folder and watched as he opened it with shaking hands. His eyes widened as he saw the first article. A recent magazine cover featuring David Peterson as Entrepreneur of the Year. "This can't be my David," Harold whispered, staring at the photograph of a confident, well-dressed man in his 50s. "This man looks so successful and important." "It is your David," Margaret said gently. "Keep reading." Harold spent the next 20 minutes going through every article Margaret had printed, his expression changing from disbelief to amazement to deep regret. Margaret watched as tears began streaming down his weathered cheeks. "He did it," Harold said finally, his voice barely audible. "He actually did everything he dreamed of doing and so much more. Look at all the good he's done, Margaret. All the people he's helped." Margaret pointed to the interview quote about David's parents. "Read this part, Harold. Read what he says about you and Eleanor." Harold read the quote aloud, his voice breaking with emotion. "He still thinks about us. After all these years and all the terrible things I said to him, he still credits us for teaching him values. Harold, your son didn't become corrupted by success," Margaret said softly. "He became exactly the kind of man you and Eleanor raised him to be. He used his wealth to help people just like you taught him. You should be incredibly proud of him." Harold was quiet for a long time, staring at a family photograph that had been included in one of the magazine articles. It showed David with his wife and 2 children at some charity event, all of them smiling and looking genuinely happy. "I have grandchildren," Harold said wonderfully. "Emma and Michael. They're beautiful, Margaret, and I've never even met them." "It's not too late," Margaret assured him. "David clearly still loves and respects you. I think he's probably been hoping you would reach out to him all these years." Harold closed the folder and looked at Margaret with determination she hadn't seen before. "How do I contact him?" "I don't even know where to begin. I can't just call up a billionaire's office and ask to speak to him." Margaret had been thinking about this problem since the previous afternoon. "Harold, I have an idea. Why don't we write him a letter? A real handwritten letter. In today's world of emails and text messages, a personal letter would stand out, and it would give you the chance to say everything you need to say without being interrupted or losing your nerve." Harold nodded eagerly. "That's a wonderful idea. But what do I say? How do I apologize for 12 years of silence? How do I explain that I was too stubborn and proud to reach out sooner?" "You start with the truth," Margaret suggested. "You tell him how sorry you are, how proud you are of what he's accomplished, and how much you've missed him. You tell him about Eleanor's final years and how much she missed him too. And you ask him if there's any possibility of rebuilding your relationship. Over the next hour, Margaret helped Harold compose a letter to his son. They worked together, with Margaret offering suggestions and Harold pouring his heart onto the paper. The letter was honest, humble, and filled with genuine remorse and love. Harold wrote about his regrets, his loneliness after Eleanor's death, and his growing realization that pride had cost him the most important relationship in his life. He told David about the magazine articles and how proud he was of the man his son had become. He asked about his grandchildren and expressed his hope that it wasn't too late to be part of their lives. Most importantly, Harold wrote about Margaret and how her kindness had helped him realize that life was too short to waste on stubborn pride. He explained that a stranger's compassion had reminded him of the values he and Eleanor had tried to instill in David, the importance of helping others and treating everyone with dignity and respect. As Harold finished writing the letter, Margaret could see a transformation taking place in her friend. The defeated, lonely man she had met a month earlier was gone, replaced by someone who had found hope and purpose again. "I can't thank you enough for helping me with this," Harold said as he sealed the envelope. "I don't know if David will respond, but at least I'll know I tried." Margaret smiled, but privately she was worried about one thing. She had Harold's address from conversations they'd had, and she had seen the rundown apartment building where he lived. She wondered what David would think when he realized how far his proud father had fallen, and whether he would be hurt or angry to discover that Harold had been struggling financially while refusing to ask for help. 3 days after Harold mailed the letter to his son, Margaret noticed that her friend seemed more nervous than she had ever seen him. He was checking his small apartment mailbox multiple times each day and jumping every time his phone rang, even though it rarely did. Margaret tried to reassure him that it might take time for David to respond, especially given how busy he probably was running a massive company. "What if he read the letter and decided he doesn't want me in his life?" Harold asked Margaret as they sat on their usual bench. "What if I waited too long and now it really is too late?" Margaret could hear the anxiety in Harold's voice and wished she could take away his worry. "Harold, from everything I read about your son, he seems like a compassionate and forgiving person. Even if he's hurt or confused, I believe he'll respond to you. You just need to be patient." What neither Harold nor Margaret knew was that David Peterson had received the letter 2 days earlier and had been carrying it with him everywhere, reading it over and over again. David had recognized his father's handwriting immediately, and seeing it after 12 years had brought back a flood of memories and emotions he had tried to suppress. David had built his business empire partly as a way to prove to his father that his dreams weren't foolish, but also partly to honor the work ethic and determination his parents had taught him. Every success had been tinged with sadness because he couldn't share it with the two people who had shaped him most profoundly. He had often wondered if Harold and Eleanor were proud of him, or if they even knew about his accomplishments. Learning about his mother's death through the letter had devastated David. Eleanor had passed away 8 months earlier, and Harold had been too proud to reach out even then. David realized he had missed the chance to say goodbye to the woman who had always believed in him, unconditionally. But the part of the letter that intrigued David most was Harold's description of Margaret Williams. His father wrote about her with such genuine affection and gratitude that David found himself curious about the woman who had shown such kindness to a lonely stranger. Harold's description painted Margaret as someone with a generous heart who had helped him find hope again during his darkest period. On Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after Harold had mailed his letter, David Peterson made a decision that would surprise everyone involved. Instead of calling or writing back, he decided to come to the park himself to see his father in person. He wanted to meet this Margaret Williams who had been so kind to Harold, and he wanted to gauge for himself whether his father was sincere about wanting to rebuild their relationship. David arrived at Riverside Park at 7:30 in the morning, driving himself in a modest sedan rather than his usual chauffeured luxury car. He didn't want to create a scene or make Harold feel uncomfortable about their different circumstances. He parked across the street from the park and waited, watching the bench where Harold had mentioned spending his mornings. At 8 o'clock sharp, David saw his father approaching the bench and his heart nearly stopped. Harold looked so much older and thinner than David remembered. 12 years had clearly been difficult for his father, and David felt a wave of guilt wash over him as he realized how much Harold had aged. A few minutes later, David watched as an African-American woman in her 50s approached the bench, carrying 2 coffee cups and what appeared to be breakfast for both herself and Harold. This had to be Margaret Williams. David studied her carefully, noting the genuine smile she gave Harold and the comfortable way they interacted. It was clear that these two had developed a real friendship. David sat in his car for nearly an hour, watching Margaret and Harold talk and laugh together. He could see that Margaret was having a positive effect on his father. Harold's posture was better when Margaret was around, and he seemed more animated and engaged than David had expected. Finally, David worked up the courage to approach them. He got out of his car and walked slowly across the street, his heart pounding with nervousness. As he got closer, he could hear Margaret encouraging Harold to stay hopeful about receiving a response to his letter. "Excuse me," David said quietly as he approached the bench. "Are you Harold Peterson?" Both Harold and Margaret looked up, startled by the interruption. Harold's face went completely white as he recognized the man standing before him. "David?" Harold whispered, struggling to stand up. "Is it really you?" "Hello, Dad," David replied, his own voice shaking with emotion. "I got your letter." Margaret immediately realized what was happening and started to stand up to give the 2 men privacy, but David stopped her. "Please don't go," David said to Margaret. "You must be Margaret Williams. My father wrote about you in his letter, and I wanted to thank you for everything you've done for him." Margaret was stunned. She had been expecting Harold's son to be successful, but she hadn't prepared herself for meeting one of the most famous businessmen in the country. I just tried to be a good friend to your father," she stammered. "According to Dad's letter, you probably saved his life," David said seriously. "And you helped convince him to reach out to me. I can never repay you for that gift." Harold was still staring at his son in amazement. "David, I can't believe you came here. I wasn't even sure you'd read the letter." "I've read it about 50 times, David admitted. "Dad, I've missed you every single day for 12 years. I've wanted to call you so many times, but I wasn't sure you wanted to hear from me after our last argument." Harold began to cry. "Son, I was wrong about everything. I was too proud and too stubborn to admit it, but I was wrong. You were right to follow your dreams, and I should have supported you instead of criticizing you. I'm so sorry for all the years we've lost." David embraced his father, and both men were crying openly. Margaret felt tears streaming down her own cheeks as she watched this reunion that had been 12 years in the making. "Dad, I want you to know that everything I've accomplished has been motivated by the values you and Mom taught me," David said. "Even when we weren't speaking, you were still influencing my decisions. Every charity I've donated to, every person I've tried to help, it all came from the lessons you gave me about treating people with dignity and using whatever advantages you have to help others." Harold looked at his son with pride and amazement. "I read about all your charitable work, David. You've helped so many people. You've become exactly the kind of man your mother and I hoped you would be." Margaret watched this emotional reunion with a mixture of joy and awkwardness. She felt like she was intruding on a private family moment. But David seemed determined to include her in the conversation. "Margaret," David said, turning to her, "I understand from Dad's letter that you've been bringing him food and spending time with him every morning. As his son, I can't tell you how grateful I am for your kindness." Margaret felt embarrassed by the attention. "Anyone would have done the same thing," she said modestly. "No," David replied firmly. "Not everyone would have done what you did. You saw a lonely stranger and decided to care about him. That takes a special kind of person." As the 3 of them talked, David learned more about Margaret's circumstances and her daily struggles to support her family. He was struck by the fact that despite her own financial challenges, she had consistently shared her food with his father and had never asked for anything in return. David also began to understand just how isolated and depressed Harold had become after Eleanor's death. It became clear that Margaret's friendship had literally pulled Harold back from the brink of despair and had given him the strength to reach out and rebuild their relationship. "I have so much I want to tell you about your grandchildren," David said to Harold. "Emma and Michael are incredible kids, and they've always wondered about their grandfather. They're going to be thrilled to meet you." Harold's face lit up with joy. "I can't wait to meet them. I've missed so much of their lives already." "We'll make up for lost time," David promised. "But first, I think we need to talk about your living situation." "Dad, I want to make sure you're comfortable and taken care of." Margaret could see that this conversation was heading toward very personal family matters, and she stood up to leave. "I should get going so you two can catch up properly," she said. But David wasn't ready to let Margaret disappear from their lives. Her kindness had brought his family back together, and he wanted to find a way to show his appreciation that went far beyond simple thank you words. Over the following weeks, Margaret watched with joy as Harold's life transformed completely. David had insisted that his father move into a comfortable apartment closer to his own family, and Harold was finally getting to know his grandchildren, Emma and Michael. The reunion had healed wounds that had been festering for over a decade, and both father and son seemed determined to make up for all the lost time. Margaret continued to meet Harold for coffee several times a week, but now their conversations were filled with Harold's excitement about his renewed relationship with his family. He would show Margaret pictures of Emma's school plays and Michael's soccer games, beaming with pride as he described his grandchildren's personalities and achievements. "Margaret, I can never thank you enough for what you've done," Harold said during one of their coffee meetings. "If you hadn't stopped to talk to me that first morning, I might never have found the courage to reach out to David. You literally gave me my family back." Margaret was genuinely happy for Harold, but she had to admit to herself that she sometimes felt a bit lonely. Now that her friend's life had become so full and busy, she was working the same 2 jobs, still struggling to make ends meet and still worrying about her children's futures. The contrast between Harold's transformed circumstances and her own unchanged situation sometimes made her reflect on how different their lives had become. What Margaret didn't know was that David Peterson had been thinking about her constantly since their first meeting in the park. He had done extensive research into Margaret's background and had learned about her financial struggles, her dedication to her children, and her reputation in the community as someone who always helped others despite having very little herself. David had discovered that Margaret's teenage daughter, Keisha, was an exceptional student who dreamed of becoming a doctor, but was worried about the cost of college. Her son Marcus was a talented artist who had been accepted to a prestigious art program, but couldn't afford the tuition. Margaret was working double shifts trying to save money for their educations, while also keeping up with rent and daily expenses. The more David learned about Margaret's situation, the more determined he became to find a way to help her without making her feel uncomfortable or charity case. He had seen how independently minded she was and how she had politely deflected Harold's suggestions that she should accept some kind of reward for her kindness. David also learned that Margaret had been volunteering at a local community center for over 5 years, helping to serve meals to homeless individuals and teaching basic computer skills to elderly residents. Despite working 2 jobs and raising 2 teenagers, she still found time to give back to her community. This information only reinforced David's belief that Margaret was an extraordinary person who deserved recognition and support. One evening, David called Harold to discuss his ideas for helping Margaret. "Dad, I've been thinking about Margaret and everything she's done for you, and for other people in the community. I want to do something meaningful to show our appreciation, but I know she's proud and independent. Do you have any suggestions?" Harold thought carefully before responding. "Son, I've gotten to know Margaret pretty well over these past few months. She's not the kind of person who would feel comfortable accepting a large sum of money or expensive gifts. But I know she worries constantly about her children's futures and whether she'll be able to give them the opportunities they deserve. What if we set up college funds for Keisha and Marcus?" David suggested. "We could make it seem like it's some kind of scholarship or grant program rather than personal charity." Harold loved this idea. "That's perfect, David. Margaret would be thrilled to know her children could go to college without her having to sacrifice everything to make it happen." David spent the next week working with his foundation's legal team to establish what they called the Community Heroes Scholarship Program. The program was designed to provide full educational funding for children of individuals who had demonstrated exceptional kindness and service to others in their communities. Margaret Williams would be the program's first recipient. David also had another idea that he discussed with Harold. He had learned that the community center where Margaret volunteered was struggling financially and was in danger of losing its funding. The center served over 200 low-income families in the area, providing meals, educational programs, and social services. David decided that the Peterson Foundation would make a substantial donation to keep the center operating and expand its programs. On a sunny Friday morning in March, David and Harold arrived at the community center where Margaret was volunteering in the kitchen, preparing lunch for the daily meal service. Margaret was surprised to see both of them together, especially since she knew Harold had a doctor's appointment that morning. "What are you two doing here?" Margaret asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Harold, I thought you had your checkup today." "We finished early," Harold replied with a mysterious smile. "David wanted to see the place where you volunteer. I've told him so much about the good work they do here." David looked around the community center, taking in the worn but clean facilities and the obvious dedication of the staff and volunteers. He could see why Margaret felt drawn to help here. It was clearly a place where people cared deeply about serving others. "Margaret," David said, "I wonder if you could spare a few minutes to talk with us. There's something we'd like to discuss with you." Margaret looked puzzled but agreed to take a short break. They found a quiet corner in the center's main room and David pulled out an official-looking folder. "Margaret, my foundation has been developing a new scholarship program," David began carefully. "We're looking for individuals in communities across the country who exemplify the kind of values we want to promote. People who help others consistently, even when they have challenges of their own." Margaret listened politely, wondering why David was telling her about his foundation's work. "Harold nominated you for our first Community Heroes Scholarship," David continued. "After reviewing your volunteer work here, your dedication to your family, and the kindness you showed to my father when he needed it most, our board has unanimously approved your nomination." Margaret still looked confused. "That's very nice, David, but I'm not in school." "I don't need a scholarship," David smiled. "The scholarship isn't for you, Margaret. It's for Keisha and Marcus. We want to provide full funding for both of their educations, college for Keisha's pre-med program and art school for Marcus." Margaret's mouth fell open in shock. I don't understand. Full funding? For both of them?" "Every penny," David confirmed. "Tuition, books, room and board, everything they need to pursue their dreams without you having to worry about the cost." Margaret began to cry, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what David was offering. "I can't accept this," she said through her tears. "This is too much. You don't owe me anything." Harold reached over and took Margaret's hand. "Margaret, you gave me back my life when I had lost all hope. You gave me back my son and my grandchildren. This scholarship isn't charity. It's a tiny fraction of what you deserve for the gift you gave our family." "But your kindness wasn't just toward my father," David added. "We've learned about all the volunteer work you do, how you help people in this community even when you're working 2 jobs and struggling yourself. You represent everything we want to celebrate with this scholarship program." Margaret was sobbing now, thinking about how this would change everything for Keisha and Marcus. Her daughter could become a doctor without graduating with crushing debt. Her son could pursue his artistic talents without her having to choose between his dreams and basic necessities. "There's one more thing," David said gently. "The Peterson Foundation is also making a donation to this community center to ensure it can continue operating and expand its programs. We want to establish a permanent endowment so that the good work happening here can continue for years to come." Margaret looked around at the community center that had become like a second home to her, imagining how much more they could do with proper funding and resources. "I don't know what to say," Margaret whispered. "This is going to change everything for my children, for this place, for so many people." "You don't have to say anything," Harold replied. "Just keep being exactly who you are, someone who sees the best in people and isn't afraid to reach out to help." David handed Margaret the scholarship documents. "There's a ceremony next month where we'll officially announce the Community Heroes Scholarship Program. We'd love to have you and your children there as our guests of honor." As Margaret read through the paperwork, she realized that this wasn't just about money. It was about recognition for the values she had tried to live by her entire life. David had created something that would help other people like her. Individuals who quietly made their communities better through small acts of kindness and service. "David, this scholarship program, are you planning to help other families too?" Margaret asked. "Absolutely," David replied. "We're going to identify community heroes in cities across the country. People like you who prove that the most important wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the positive impact you have on other people's lives. Margaret felt a profound sense of gratitude and purpose. Not only were her children's futures secure, but her story would inspire a program that would help countless other families. The simple decision to stop and talk to a lonely stranger had created ripples that would affect people she would never even meet. That evening, Margaret called Keisha and Marcus to share the incredible news. Their reactions of joy and disbelief reminded her of how transformative this opportunity would be for their entire family. For the first time in years, Margaret went to bed without worrying about money or her children's futures. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the grand ballroom of the Peterson Foundation's headquarters, wearing an elegant dress that David had insisted on providing for the occasion. She was surrounded by her children, Keisha and Marcus, who looked proud and slightly overwhelmed by the formal atmosphere. Harold was there too, looking healthier and happier than Margaret had ever seen him, accompanied by David's family. The Community Heroes Scholarship Program had grown beyond anyone's initial expectations. David had received thousands of nominations from across the country, each one telling the story of someone who had made a difference in their community through simple acts of kindness and service. The program was now providing educational funding for over 50 families, and David had committed to expanding it significantly over the coming years. Margaret had been invited to speak at the Foundation's annual gala, where she would share her story and help launch the program's second year. She was nervous about addressing the audience of donors, business leaders, and community activists, but David had assured her that her words would inspire others to look for ways to help their neighbors. As Margaret looked around the elegant ballroom, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that cold November morning, when she had first approached Harold on the park bench. Keisha was now thriving in her pre-med program at a prestigious university, calling home every week to share her excitement about her classes and her growing confidence that she would achieve her dream of becoming a doctor. Marcus had blossomed at art school, already having his work featured in student exhibitions and attracting the attention of professional galleries. Margaret herself had also experienced changes she never could have imagined. David had offered her a position with the Peterson Foundation, working to identify and evaluate community heroes nominations from around the country. The job paid twice what she had been earning from her 2 previous jobs combined, and it allowed her to use her natural empathy and understanding of community needs to help others receive recognition and support. "Ladies and gentlemen," David said as he approached the podium to introduce Margaret, "tonight we're honoring someone who embodies everything the Community Heroes Scholarship Program represents. Margaret Williams shows us that heroism isn't about grand gestures or public recognition. It's about seeing someone in need and choosing to care." The audience applauded as Margaret made her way to the podium, her heart racing but her resolve strong. She thought about Harold, who had become like family to her, and about all the people she had met through her new work with the foundation, individuals who proved every day that kindness was the most powerful force for change in the world. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Margaret began, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "When I stopped to talk to a lonely stranger on a park bench 8 months ago, I never imagined it would lead to this moment. I certainly never expected that a simple act of sharing my lunch would change not only his life, but mine as well." She went on to tell the story of meeting Harold, of their friendship, and of how his reunion with David had opened doors she never knew existed. But Margaret was careful to emphasize that the real lesson wasn't about the rewards that had come to her family. It was about the importance of treating every person with dignity and compassion, regardless of their circumstances. "I learned that you never know who you're helping when you choose kindness," Margaret said. Harold could have been anyone. He could have remained a lonely, forgotten elderly man with no family and no resources. But even if that had been the case, he still would have deserved compassion and friendship. "We don't help people because of what they might be able to give us in return. We help people because it's the right thing to do." The audience was captivated by Margaret's sincerity and wisdom. She spoke about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances and recognizing that everyone has a story worth knowing. She challenged the wealthy and powerful people in the room to remember that true success was measured not by what they accumulated, but by how they lifted up others. Margaret also spoke about the community heroes she had met through her work with the foundation, teachers who used their own money to buy supplies for students, Neighbors who organized food drives for struggling families. Volunteers who spent their weekends helping elderly people with household tasks. These unsung heroes, she explained, were the backbone of strong communities. The Peterson Foundation is not just providing scholarships, Margaret concluded. It's sending a message that kindness matters, that compassion has value, and that ordinary people doing extraordinary things deserve recognition and support. Every family we help represents hundreds of lives that will be touched by education, opportunity, and hope. As Margaret finished her speech, the entire ballroom erupted in applause. People were standing, many wiping away tears, clearly moved by her words and her story. David beamed with pride, knowing that Margaret's message would inspire many of the donors to increase their support for the program. After the formal program ended, Margaret found herself surrounded by people who wanted to share their own stories of kindness they had witnessed or experienced. A businessman told her about a janitor at his company who had started a mentorship program for at-risk youth. A socialite described her gardener, who had organized his entire neighborhood to help rebuild a family's home after a fire. Harold appeared at Margaret's side as the evening wound down, his eyes twinkling with joy and pride. "You are magnificent up there," he said, giving her a warm hug. "Eleanor would have loved you, Margaret. She always said that the best people were those who helped others without expecting anything in return." David joined them, along with his wife Sarah and their children Emma and Michael, whom Margaret had grown to love like her own grandchildren. "Margaret, I have something to tell you," David said with a grin. "The response to your speech tonight has been incredible. 3 new major donors have committed to supporting the scholarship program, and we've received over 24 new Community Heroes nominations just from people who were here tonight." Margaret felt tears of joy welling up in her eyes. The ripple effects of kindness just kept expanding, touching more and more lives in ways she was only beginning to understand. As the evening came to an end, Margaret rode home with Keisha and Marcus, all of them reflecting on how surreal the experience had been. Her children were amazed by their mother's poise and eloquence, and by the respect and admiration she had clearly earned from some of the most influential people in the city. "Mom," Keisha said as they pulled into their driveway, "I always knew you were special, but tonight I realized that other people see it too. You've inspired so many people to look for ways to help their communities." Marcus nodded in agreement. "And the best part is that this is just the beginning. The scholarship program is going to help so many families, and it all started because you decided to be kind to a stranger." Margaret smiled as she looked at her children, thinking about how proud she was of the young adults they were becoming. Keisha was already volunteering at free health clinics during her breaks from school, and Marcus was using his artistic talents to create murals for community centers in low-income neighborhoods. The next morning, Margaret returned to Riverside Park for the first time in months. She sat on the bench where she had first met Harold, remembering that cold November day when she had made the decision to approach a lonely stranger. The park looked different now. Spring flowers were blooming, and the morning sun felt warm on her face. As she sat there, Margaret noticed a young woman pushing a stroller while talking animatedly on her phone. The woman was clearly stressed, juggling what sounded like work problems while trying to keep her toddler entertained. The little boy in the stroller was crying, and the mother looked exhausted and overwhelmed. Without hesitation, Margaret approached the young woman and offered to help. "Excuse me," she said gently. "You look like you could use an extra pair of hands. Would you like me to watch your little one for a few minutes while you finish your call?" The young mother looked surprised but grateful. "That would be amazing," she said. "I'm dealing with a crisis at work and my babysitter canceled at the last minute." As Margaret played with the toddler, making him laugh and forget his earlier distress, she realized that some things never change. There would always be people who needed help, kindness, and compassion. The circumstances might be different, but the opportunity to make a positive difference in someone's day remained constant. Margaret had learned that kindness was not a one-time act, but a way of living. Every day presented new opportunities to choose compassion over indifference, to reach out instead of walking by, to see the humanity in every person she encountered. The Community Heroes Scholarship Program continued to grow and thrive, helping hundreds of families and inspiring thousands of acts of kindness across the country. Margaret's story became a symbol of how one person's decision to care could create waves of positive change that extended far beyond anything they could have imagined. Years later, When people asked Margaret about the secret to her success and happiness, she would always give the same answer. Look for opportunities to help others, especially when they can't help you in return. Kindness is never wasted, even when you can't see its immediate impact. Sometimes the smallest gestures create the biggest miracles. And in Riverside Park, on the bench where it all began, a small plaque was installed that read, "In honor of Margaret Williams and Harold Peterson, who proved that friendship can bloom anywhere when we choose to see each other with compassionate eyes. Every act of kindness matters."